Story 1. First day at Pollsmoor felt like walking into chaos. The noise hit me first, people shouting, metal doors slamming, and guards yelling. I tried to act tough, but honestly, I was shaking inside. My cell was overcrowded, and there was barely any space to lie down. I remember thinking, how will I survive this? Story 2. I was shocked at how quickly the gang members approached me. Within minutes, they were already sizing me up, trying to see if I'd be useful, or if they'd have to scare me. They didn't say much, but the looks they gave said everything. I kept my head down and didn't make eye contact, just like I was told. Still, I felt like prey. Story 3. The smell was the first thing that hit me. It was a mix of sweat, mold, and something rotten that seemed to cling to everything. I realized there was barely any ventilation, and showers were a luxury. People were packed into cells with no space to move or breathe. I couldn't believe that people could live like that every day. Story 4. The guards treated us like animals, not people. They barked orders, barely looked us in the eyes, and if someone hesitated, they'd shove them hard. I thought I'd be able to keep my dignity, but Pollsmoor has a way of stripping that away fast. I learned on day 1 to do exactly as told. Any small mistake could mean real trouble. Story 5. Sleeping arrangements were a nightmare. There were far more inmates than beds, so many of us had to sleep on the hard floor. I had to share a thin mattress with another guy who'd been there for years. There was no privacy, and fights would break out if someone crossed another's sleeping space. It was survival of the fittest. Story 6. I remember the first meal like it was yesterday. They gave us thin porridge that looked like gray water and tasted like cardboard. There were flies everywhere, and some people refused to eat, saying they'd rather starve. I didn't have that option. I forced myself to swallow every bite. You learn quickly that food is precious in there. Story 7. The first fight I saw was brutal. 2 guys were arguing over a spot on the floor, and within seconds, punches were flying. The guards just watched and only stepped in when one guy was bleeding badly. I realized that violence wasn't just possible here, it was normal. Pollsmoor was a place where you either toughened up fast or became a target. Story 8. The noise never stopped. There was constant shouting, banging on cell bars, and people trying to communicate from cell to cell. I couldn't believe that no one ever seemed to sleep. I'd close my eyes, but the sounds just went on, keeping me wide awake. It felt like I was losing my mind. Story 9. The lack of personal space was the worst part. There were so many people crammed in one cell that you couldn't even sit comfortably. I had to curl up in a corner to sleep, but someone would always bump into me. It was like living in a crowded, noisy cage. I'd never been so uncomfortable in my life. Story 10. The first time I saw a guard beat someone, I was stunned. The inmate had just asked for a blanket because it was freezing at night. The guard snapped and started hitting him with a baton, while the rest of us stood there, helpless. I realized quickly that asking for anything could be dangerous. Pollsmoor didn't offer mercy. Story 11. There was a constant feeling of fear in the air. Everyone was watching their back, even when they were supposed to be resting. I could see it in the eyes of the guys around me. We were all afraid of something or someone. Fights could break out at any moment, and you never knew who was going to snap next. I learned to stay quiet and keep to myself. Story 12. The first night was freezing, and there were no blankets. I lay on the concrete floor, shivering, with nothing to keep me warm. Some guys had layers they'd brought from outside, but I had nothing. I tried to curl up to conserve heat, but it didn't help. I barely slept, just counting down the hours till morning. Story 13. Pollsmoor was like stepping into another world. It was nothing like I imagined. Everything felt heavy and hopeless. The walls were covered in grime, and there was graffiti scratched into every surface. People just stared at you, sizing you up from the moment you walked in. I felt like I was losing myself on day 1. Story 14. Everywhere I looked, I saw gangs. I quickly figured out that there were invisible lines and rules you just didn't cross. Each gang controlled different areas, and as a newcomer, I had no idea what those were. I had to rely on whispers from others to figure out where I was allowed to be. One wrong step, and you'd get hurt. Story 15. Seeing the younger guys was heartbreaking. Some kids looked barely out of their teens, thrown in with hardened criminals. They tried to act tough, but you could tell they were scared. Older inmates would prey on them, taking whatever little they had. I couldn't believe how easily they were just thrown in with everyone else. Story 16. I saw a man stabbed over a simple argument. They were arguing over a seat, and suddenly one guy just pulled out a shiv. The whole thing happened so fast, and no one moved to help. The guards didn't even react. It was like this was just another day for them. I realized then that your life meant nothing here. Story 17. There were rats everywhere. They'd come out at night, crawling over the floors, and sometimes even onto the beds. No matter how much you tried to cover up, you couldn't avoid them. It felt like they were just another part of prison life. You either got used to it or went crazy. Story 18. I couldn't believe how dirty the place was. There was trash everywhere, and the toilets were disgusting, often clogged or overflowing. The smell was horrible, and it only got worse in the summer. We were supposed to clean our own cells, but no one cared. We were left to live in filth. Story 19. The lack of medical care was shocking. One guy had an infection that got worse over days, and no one came to help. By the time they finally took him out, he was barely conscious. It was like they didn't care if people died. I learned quickly that you were on your own. Story 20. Food was barely edible. The portions were tiny, and sometimes you'd find bugs or hairs in it. People would complain, but it didn't change anything. I learned to eat fast and ignore the taste. Hunger makes you desperate. Story 21. The guards didn't care if we fought. I saw a guy get jumped, and the guards just stood there watching. They only intervened after it was clear someone could die. It felt like a game to them, like we were animals for their entertainment. I lost any respect I had for them that day. Story 22. Hygiene didn't seem to exist in Pollsmoor. There was barely any soap, and showers were rare. People got sick, and the smell was everywhere. You had to fight just to get a turn at the sink. It was like living in a dump. Story 23. New inmates were often targeted for bullying. As soon as someone new arrived, older inmates would find ways to intimidate or take advantage. They'd demand food, cigarettes, anything they could get. It was a constant cycle of bullying and fear. I kept to myself to avoid it. Story 24. I saw people lose all hope. Some guys stopped talking, stopped eating, and just shut down completely. Pollsmoor breaks you if you're not strong enough. I watched as people faded away right in front of me. It was the saddest thing I've ever seen. Story 25. Privacy didn't exist. There were no doors, no private space. Everything was open. People saw you at your worst, and there was no hiding. It stripped away any dignity you had left. I learned to stop caring. Story 26. Young offenders had no protection. I saw young guys get hurt because they were easy targets. The older ones would rob them or force them into gangs. It was heartbreaking to see kids so young in that kind of place. They didn't stand a chance. Story 27. There was no respect for life. Fights could break out over the smallest things, and people would get hurt or worse. The guards didn't care. They just let us tear each other apart. I realized my life was worth nothing in there. It was terrifying. Story 28. The cold nights were unbearable. There were no proper blankets, and the concrete floor made it worse. People would huddle together just to stay warm. I never knew cold like that. It felt like the place was designed to break you. Story 29. Pollsmoor was a test of patience. Everything moved slowly, from meal times to visits, to medical help. You could wait hours for a simple request, only to be ignored. It taught me to stop hoping for anything. I felt like I was just wasting away. Story 30. Some inmates were there for so long they forgot who they were. I met guys who couldn't remember their life outside. They had been inside for so many years that Pollsmoor was all they knew. It was like they had become part of the prison itself. I was afraid that would happen to me too. Story 31. The first time I heard someone scream in the middle of the night, I couldn't sleep. I had no idea what was happening, but the sound was chilling and full of agony. People didn't react. They just lay there like it was normal. The guards ignored it completely, as if someone's pain didn't matter. I remember staring up at the ceiling, feeling helpless and trapped. That was when I realized that Pollsmoor was a place where no one would help you no matter what. Story 32. Walking into Pollsmoor, I felt like I was stepping into a nightmare. The halls were dark, filthy, and the smell of sweat and decay was overwhelming. There were too many people squeezed into one place, all angry or afraid. I barely had room to stand, let alone lie down, and privacy was out of the question. As I took it all in, I realized that dignity didn't exist here. Pollsmoor wasn't just a prison. It was a place designed to strip you of humanity. Story 33. The guard showed zero mercy, even to sick inmates. One guy in my cell had a terrible cough and struggled to breathe, but the guards ignored him for days. We all tried to get their attention, but they just told us to shut up. He got worse each day, his skin looking paler and his breathing more shallow. Only when he collapsed did they finally drag him to medical. It was a harsh reminder that, to Pollsmoor, we were all disposable. Story 34. Everyone warned me about the initiation for newcomers. I thought I could keep a low profile, but as soon as I entered, some older inmates cornered me. They took my shoes, my food, and told me it was the price of being a newbie. I tried not to react, but inside I was terrified. I realized quickly that if I didn't learn the rules fast, I'd lose more than just my belongings. Pollsmoor wasn't a place you could walk into without consequences. Story 35. The violence was non-stop, even over things like food. I once saw two guys get into a brutal fight over a piece of bread. It seemed insane to me, but in Pollsmoor, food was more than just food, it was power and survival. The guards stood back and watched like it was entertainment. Eventually, one of them pulled the guys apart, but the damage was already done. Moments like that showed me just how desperate life inside could be. Story 36. Gang recruitment was relentless, and saying no wasn't an option. On my second day, a gang approached me, asking where I stood. When I tried to say I wasn't interested, they laughed and warned me that everyone needed protection here. I felt trapped because saying no meant risking their wrath, but saying yes meant I'd lose my freedom. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept my head down. Pollsmoor felt like a prison within a prison, with the gangs running the show. Story 37. The overcrowding made even breathing hard. Our cell was packed with so many people that even moving was a struggle. At night, the heat and smell of so many bodies made it almost impossible to sleep. I remember pressing myself into a corner just trying to get a bit of air. The lack of space and constant tension weighed on everyone. Pollsmoor's overcrowding was like a constant reminder that we didn't matter. Story 38. Showering was a nightmare, no privacy, and constant fear. The showers were one of the most dangerous places in the prison. Fights, intimidation, and worse things happened there regularly. I'd rush in and out, never daring to turn my back. Every time I felt exposed and vulnerable, but we had no choice, we had to use them. It was a part of life in Pollsmoor that filled everyone with dread. Story 39. One of my cellmates lost it one day and started screaming at the walls. He had been acting strange for days, muttering to himself and pacing. Then one night, he just snapped, yelling at no one and hitting his head against the bars. We all backed away, unsure of what he'd do next. The guards didn't care. They just watched and smirked. Pollsmoor had finally broken him, and it was like watching a part of him disappear. Story 40. Every night was a struggle against rats. They were everywhere, scurrying around and gnawing on anything they could find. We'd have to keep our shoes on to avoid getting bitten, even while trying to sleep. Sometimes, you'd wake up to the sound of them scratching or find one running over your leg. I hated it, but there was no escape from them. The rats were just another part of the misery Pollsmoor offered. Story 41. I saw a man collapse from exhaustion in the yard. He'd been working all day, pushing his limits just to get by. When he fell, nobody ran to help him, not even the guards. They yelled at him to get up, acting like he was just lazy. Watching him struggle, I realized that even the smallest show of weakness could be dangerous here. Pollsmoor didn't just wear you down. It made sure you stayed down. Story 42. My cell was filled with broken souls, men who had nothing left. They had been inside so long that Pollsmoor was all they knew. They'd lost their families, their friends, and any hope for the future. Sometimes, I'd try to talk to them, but they'd just stare blankly. I could feel Pollsmoor's weight pressing down on them, crushing what little spirit they had left. It was like they were already dead inside. Story 43. Some inmates traded whatever they had just to survive. People would give up food, clothes, or even perform tasks for others just to avoid trouble. It felt desperate, but it was the only way to survive sometimes. Seeing people so stripped of pride and hope was hard to watch. You could tell how Pollsmoor had broken them, turning them into shadows of who they used to be. Here, survival came at any cost. Story 44. The toilets were so filthy, people avoided using them for days. They were constantly overflowing, and the stench filled our entire cell. We tried to cover our noses, but there was no escaping it. Meals were eaten near these same toilets, making us all feel degraded. Living like that was humiliating, like being treated worse than animals. It was a daily reminder that Pollsmoor was built to break you. Story 45. A fight broke out over a book someone brought in. Books were rare in Pollsmoor, and they provided a small escape from the misery around us. One day, two guys started fighting over a book, grabbing and pulling as if their lives depended on it. The guards just watched, letting them fight it out. Finally, one guy took the book, leaving the other beaten on the floor. Watching people turn so desperate over something so small was heartbreaking. Story 46. A young guy in my cell tried to talk back to a gang member. He was new, barely out of his teens, and thought he could stand up for himself. The gang member didn't like his attitude and beat him so badly he was bruised for weeks. We all watched, feeling powerless and terrified of what would happen to us if we made a wrong move. I realized quickly that Pollsmoor wasn't a place for pride. It was a place where survival meant submission. Story 47. People would go days without washing because they feared the showers. The showers were notorious for being unsafe, and violence could erupt in an instant. So many guys chose to avoid them, putting up with the filth to stay safe. It felt awful, but personal safety took priority over hygiene. Pollsmoor forced us to live in a way that no human should ever have to. Story 48. One night, I saw an older man get attacked for his blanket. It was freezing, and blankets were like gold in Pollsmoor. A younger guy snatched it from him while he was sleeping, and when he tried to take it back, things turned violent. Nobody stepped in to help. We all just turned away, knowing it could just as easily be us. He spent the rest of the night shivering, his pride and warmth stolen. Pollsmoor taught me that even the smallest comforts could cost you everything. Story 49. The sound of chains rattling was a constant reminder of where I was. Every morning, guards would march us out, the sound of chains echoing through the halls. It was humiliating, like something from an old movie, except it was our daily life. No one spoke, just the heavy steps and cold metal clinking as we moved. Those chains made you feel like less than human, stripping away any sense of dignity. In Pollsmoor, even freedom of movement was a distant dream. Story 50. I watched as two brothers turned on each other for food. They had come in together, close and protective, but hunger and desperation wore them down. One day, they started fighting over a small piece of bread, shouting and throwing punches. It was painful to watch, but survival here meant everyone for themselves. The guards watched with a cruel smile, as if they enjoyed watching families fall apart. Pollsmoor had a way of breaking even the strongest bonds. Story 51. Guards used strip searches to humiliate us, not just for security. They'd make us strip in front of each other, with no privacy or respect. You could see the shame in everyone's faces, but we couldn't do anything about it. It was all a game for the guards, a way to assert control and make us feel worthless. That daily humiliation was like salt in a wound. In Pollsmoor, dignity was a luxury we couldn't afford. Story 52. I once saw someone get punished just for asking for more water. It was a hot day, and he was clearly dehydrated, but the guard didn't care. Instead of helping, they made him stand for hours as punishment, barely able to stay on his feet. We watched, afraid to speak up or we'd get the same treatment. Seeing someone suffer for something so basic was heartbreaking. In Pollsmoor, even asking for water was seen as a rebellion. Story 53. The smell of disinfectant mixed with rot was everywhere. They'd clean the floors, but the dirt and decay were too deep to really remove. The whole place reeked, and no matter how many times they tried, it never smelled clean. We all got used to it eventually, but that stench stayed in your nose, a reminder of where we were. Pollsmoor was a place that clung to you, even when you wanted nothing more than to escape. That smell was like a prison itself. Story 54. The nurses were often rude, treating us like we didn't deserve care. When you were sick, you'd have to beg for help, and even then, they'd often ignore you. If you were lucky, you'd get a quick look, but usually, they'd just tell you to drink water and rest. One guy in our cell had an infection that got worse because they wouldn't treat him properly. By the time they finally helped, he was in serious pain. Pollsmoor made it clear, your health was your problem, not theirs. Story 55. There was always this deep feeling of betrayal. Some of us came in believing we'd be treated fairly, but Pollsmoor stripped that away quickly. Friends turned on friends, people lied and cheated to get by. You learn fast that trust was a dangerous thing to give. The prison itself seemed to encourage betrayal as a means of survival. In the end, you were on your own, and that was the harshest reality of all. Story 56. People would try anything just to get a little sleep. The noise was constant, with people talking, yelling, and crying all night long. Some inmates would put socks over their ears, or even wrap shirts around their heads to block it out. I remember seeing grown men so exhausted they'd fall asleep sitting up. It was heartbreaking to see people reduced to such measures just for a few hours of rest. Pollsmoor was relentless, even in the quiet moments. Story 57. Someone tried to escape once, and we all heard about it. He got pretty far, but they caught him and brought him back badly beaten. They paraded him through the halls, bloodied and broken, as a warning to the rest of us. Seeing him like that made escape seem impossible and terrifying. Pollsmoor wasn't just a prison of walls. It was a place that crushed any hope of freedom. After that, no one dared to dream of getting out. Story 58. The laundry was where a lot of people tried to smuggle things. Small items like cigarettes or extra food would be hidden in clothes, but it was risky. If the guards caught you, they'd punish you and take whatever they found. I watched someone get dragged out for hiding something as simple as a snack. It was a reminder that Pollsmoor had eyes everywhere, and even the smallest comforts were forbidden. Nothing was truly yours here. Story 59. The lack of sunlight drove people crazy. We'd be locked up for so many hours that days blended into nights. When we did get to go outside, it felt like breathing for the first time, even though we were still caged. You'd see men just staring up at the sky, soaking in every bit of sunlight they could. Pollsmoor took away so much, but taking away the light felt like a special kind of cruelty. We all came to crave it more than anything else. Story 60. One guard would get enjoyment out of throwing food on the floor. He'd dump our meals on the dirty ground and make us pick it up if we wanted to eat. I watched as proud men, starving, had to bend down and eat like animals. It was degrading, and he did it just because he could. In Pollsmoor, power was in their hands, and they used it to humiliate us. We had no choice but to comply if we wanted to survive. Story 61. An inmate once lost his mind and started talking to himself all day. At first, he'd just mutter, but over time, he'd hold full conversations with thin air. No one knew what set him off, but it was like the walls had swallowed his sanity. It scared everyone because we saw what Pollsmoor could do to the mind. Watching him fall apart felt like watching our own futures. In Pollsmoor, sanity was a fragile thing. Story 62. They would mix punishments into our daily routine, like forcing us to stand for hours. If someone got in trouble, the whole cell would be punished. It didn't matter who was guilty. Standing for hours in the heat or cold, sometimes without shoes, was exhausting. By the end, we'd be shaking and aching, but they didn't care. Pollsmoor's punishments were about control, not justice. They wanted us to know we were powerless. Story 63. I saw an inmate get attacked just for having a photo of his family. He kept it hidden, but someone spotted it and decided they wanted it. They tore it up right in front of him, laughing while he tried to pick up the pieces. That photo was the only connection he had to his life outside, and now it was gone. Pollsmoor stripped away not only our freedom, but our memories too. They wanted us to forget who we once were. Story 64. Seeing young guys come in was the hardest. Some of them were barely adults, and you could see the fear in their eyes. Older inmates would immediately try to intimidate them, making their first days a nightmare. I tried to tell them to stay quiet and keep to themselves, but Pollsmoor wasn't a place that let you do that. Watching them lose that innocent hope was like watching flowers wither. Story 65. A lot of us ended up having to protect others just to keep peace. Some inmates were constantly targeted, bullied, and hurt. You'd form alliances, trying to look out for each other in any way you could. But helping someone often came with risks, making you a target, too. Pollsmoor forced everyone to make impossible choices. It was a place that pitted survival against loyalty every day. Story 66. The food was so bad that people would trade anything just for a fresh piece of fruit. We'd get a spoonful of beans or some bread, but it was barely enough to fill you. When someone managed to get an apple or something fresh, it was like gold. I watched people give up their own belongings for a bite of something real. Pollsmoor's food made hunger a constant companion. Those small moments of taste reminded us of life outside. Story 67. We'd all become silent whenever someone was taken to solitary. It was the worst punishment and everyone knew it. Watching someone get led down that hallway felt like a funeral procession. We knew they'd come back different, quiet, or even broken. Pollsmoor's solitary wasn't just about being alone. It was about stripping away every last piece of hope.